Hello everyone, welcome to another monitoring power hour. I hope everyone can see the screen okay and hear me all right, as well as see me. So if you're having any technical issues or you can't see or hear, just let me know and I'll make sure it's working on our side here. All right, I think we're good and we'll get started. So this month's power hour on monitoring is focused on monitoring in Trimble Business Center. So to start, I'll give a quick introduction of myself. My name is Riley Smith. I'm the product marketing manager focusing on monitoring and tunneling applications in the Trimble Geospatial group. And I'm based in Westminster, Colorado in the US. And I've left my email address there in case anyone wants to reach out to me after the webinar. So today we're going to focus on the concept of manual monitoring, also sometimes known as campaign-based or periodic monitoring. And we'll talk about what that is and also how Trimble is bringing systems and solutions to the monitoring service providers. So we'll look at monitoring in action both on the field side, looking at Trimble Access Monitoring, and also on the office workflow where we'll talk about TBC and the upcoming monitoring module in TBC. And then we'll get into a more in-depth look at the TBC monitoring workflow and a live demonstration. And towards the end, I'll save some time to go over some resources and next steps if you're curious to find out more about TBC monitoring, as well as time for Q&A. I'll periodically check the chat for any questions as we go through, so feel free to enter those at any time, and I'll probably take a break here sometime through the webinar to answer a few and as well at the end. Perfect. All right, with that, let's get into it. So manual monitoring. As I mentioned, manual monitoring, sometimes also known as campaign-based monitoring. Let's look at some of the characteristics. What is manual monitoring? So typically, when we go out to site and do a survey for a manual monitoring project, the monumentation could be permanent, it could be concrete pillars, but a lot of the time it's not necessarily. It could be brass caps, it could be monuments that were installed by the surveyor themselves. The sensor itself, so the total station, the GNSS receiver, the level, whatever it might be, is not typically fixed on site. It's brought to and from site. So that could be a tri-brack on a pillar. It could be a tripod to ease that setup. In terms of measurements, it's either a low frequency, meaning very seldom, so every week, every month, once a year, or it's short-term, high, rapid measurements. Think of an 8-hour workday where you're monitoring a construction project and you need to monitor some points every 10, 15 minutes. So the duration of the entire project is short, but the measurement frequency is quite high. There's typically a low level of risk and safety concern when it comes to manual monitoring. Because it's not an automated system, there's no need for real-time reporting and alarming typically, and that's because of the low level of risk and safety concern. The data processing and any adjustments or any quality control is typically done after the survey, usually done in the office, and not in real time on a server or system. And manual monitoring is usually selected as the method for short-term, small-scale projects, as it's typically more cost-effective than deploying a automated system. So these are some basic characteristics. They're not all-encompassing by any means, and some general things to think of when you're deciding for monitoring systems. So now let's look at Trimble manual monitoring systems. So first we start on the left-hand side with the field process. So this is all about data collection, scheduling. How are we collecting those manual monitoring measurements? So it could be with a variety of sensors. When we look at survey or geodetic sensors, we're talking about total stations. We're talking about GNSS, whether that's RTK, static observations. Levels could be automatic or digital levels. It could be also hand measurements. It could be with a tape measure, it could be with a variety of other tools. Now with that data collection, we typically want some type of software to help streamline that process or give us some results in the field in somewhat real time. And that's where an application like Trimble Access Monitoring comes into play, where we can essentially streamline the collection of multiple sets of data, as well as view those deviations, those displacements over time. Now, there's also, of course, an element of how do you get that data to the office for processing and for additional reporting. And you can use a tool that streamlines that process, such as Trimble Sync Manager, where you can have that nice connection between the field office. You can also do that transfer manually, USB, email, Dropbox, or any of the kind of conventional ways of transferring data files. But in the office, where we're going to spend most of our time in the webinar today, we need a software to do data management, processing, and reporting. So having all of those sets of data from all the time series on the monitoring project, being able to manage those somewhere and also process them, whether I need to do an adjustment, maybe I need to edit some of the raw data, the instrument heights, the prism constants, and so forth. And then we would need to generate those displacement reports to show any movement on site and as well as flag that. And that's where we're going to talk about Trimble Business Center monitoring. Just give me one moment. I'm just going to make sure there's no issues and look at the chat here and the questions, see if we're all good. I don't see any red flags from anyone, so awesome. We'll keep going with things. So look a little more in depth right now at monitoring data collection in the field. And with that, we're going to talk about Trimble Access Monitoring. So this is focused on optical total station measurements and really streamlining the collection of multiple rounds and sets to reduce operator input and really time in the field. So when you think about it, if I have to measure several sets and rounds of different monitoring points, I'm pointing, I'm doing the different sets, I'm turning face, and I'm collecting all that. It's really a big time saver to have software that will automate that process. We have those points, we have the targets, we know their prisms, we know their DR measurements, and we can use the Trimble S-Series robotic instruments to do that automation with Trimble Access. So there's really 4 components of that application. First, it starts with the round configuration and scheduling. So where are my targets? What kind of target are they? Are they a prism? Are they a DR measurement? Am I using auto lock? Am I using fine lock? All that type of information. And then how often do I want to measure it? So if we go back talking about those manual monitoring examples, if it's a short-term construction project, maybe I do need to measure it every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes. And so I want to schedule that out, and I want the software to do most of that work for me and just alarm me when there is movement so I can notify the construction crews and anyone on site. That second tier is about automating versus manual measurements. So both are available. The automatic is what I was just referring to, where we can schedule based on the target locations, the type of targets they are, and the robotic instrument itself. And the manual being just the ability to manually point and measure for basic measurements for monitoring. That third tier is the basic reporting and charting in Trimble Access. So not only can you collect that data, you can also generate some basic statistics and displacement reports in the form of scatter plots and displacement charts while in the field. So you have something in your hands while you're in the field before you leave. And then that final part is about defining thresholds and warnings. So not only are we measuring, but we want to also specify a movement tolerance. So if points from epoch to epoch are out of that tolerance, then the user is aware of that from the software. So that's the field portion. Now getting into more in-depth side of things with Trimble Business Center in the office. So we'll be introducing a new module in Trimble Business Center called the monitoring module, and that'll be coming out in the next version of TBC, version 5.4. So stay tuned for more info about that. And really, this is all about taking the great capabilities that TBC already has, the visualization, the ability to do the CAD and the survey and the design, data prep, and also introducing a concept of monitoring with that. So being able to monitor in confidence in TBC. So I want to be clear that this is focused on that manual or campaign-based monitoring and not the automated monitoring where we were more focused using the T4D platform. But the real power of having a monitoring module in TBC is the ability to combine all of that different survey data. So not just total station, but level, GNSS, and even ability to use point cloud data for manual monitoring. Along with that, we can define 2 levels of thresholds. We can define warning and alarm thresholds to flag any of those points if there's significant movement from epoch to epoch or time series along the time series. And then we can also visualize that displacement in TBC using 3D vectors. So we can actually show it in the plan in 3D views, and you can use that to check if there's any trends or any significant movement just based on the visual aspect. And then of course, the final thing is really the primary thing that we're trying to get out of any manual monitoring project. It's the reports and the charts that show that displacement and that movement. So before we even get to the demo, let's look at a high level of how we're adding the aspect of time, which is what monitoring is really all about, is adding that aspect of time to survey data in TBC. So let's run through this workflow. So we start, of course, in the field. We collect the data, whether that's Trimble Access or another software or another means, and then we export that data out, whether it's through a job JXL file, maybe it's just a basic ASCII CSV file, and we take that data and we put it into a TBC project. And when we say that TBC project, it's a .vce file. So you'll hear me refer to that. And this is kind of essentially our first set of data. So we've collected our first epoch, our baseline, our reference measurements, and that's our first VC project. Now, the next step, which is new for a lot of TBC users, is synchronizing that data to what we call our monitoring project. Now, a monitoring project sits within TBC, but also sits in the Trimble cloud ecosystem. So we have a Trimble monitoring cloud service that is essentially managing all of these monitoring points, let's call them, and the timestamps associated with them. And that enables us to calculate all the displacements and create these reports and charts, which you'll see a little later. So that's our reference timestamp. Now, as we collect the next set of data, so epoch 1, we do the same process. We collect it in the field. We import a field file into TBC, into a new VC project, and then we synchronize that to the same monitoring project. So the same monitoring project, but multiple TBC projects. And we do the same thing over time for however many epochs that project lasts. And then what do we get in the end? After we have 2 or more TBC projects, we get the reporting and the deliverable aspects in TBC as well. And we'll go through a demo of that. So that's an overview of the workflow, but we'll get into that in more detail. So for those of you who end up getting a demo or purchasing the TBC monitoring module, you'll see a new tab in the TBC ribbon called monitoring. And there's 6 new commands that go along with that. And so as I mentioned in terms of the workflow, there's really 6 steps that are cycled through for each epoch of measurement. So when I say epoch, I want to be clear, that's essentially that timestamp of data. So if I collect 4 different sets of data, let's say 4 different days, each one of those days or each one of those sets of data is an epoch. So what you start with is, of course, you create that TBC project, you import that data, you do any adjustments or QC. So if I'm doing a network adjustment or I have to change target heights or anything like that, I can do all that work. And then I associate that TBC project with a monitoring project. So I either use an existing monitoring project, but in most cases, to start with, you'll be creating a new one. And then you associate which points in your project are points you want to monitor. So you might not want to actually get displacements from all of the points in your project. You might only need a handful. So there's a tool for that. And then we synchronize that with the monitoring cloud service. And then you repeat that steps 1 through 6 for each epoch of data that you have. So let's say I have 10 epochs, I would have 10 TBC projects, and that's where I manage those epochs. And then once you have 2 or more epochs, when we can actually calculate a displacement, steps 7, 8, and 9, where you have the displacement charts, the reports, the vectors, and the spreadsheets, and we'll show all those in TBC here in a minute. So I'll go through that workflow in a little more detail. I'm kind of hammering at home of how that workflow progresses. So of course, step 1, create that new TBC project. Step 2, we import the data, whether that's through a JXL, CSV, doesn't matter as long as it can go into TBC, and it creates a point ID, we can monitor it. Then we'll perform any adjustments. So it could be a network adjustment, traverse adjustment, whatever it might be. And then one of the new commands is this assign monitoring project command, which you can see on the right-hand side. So we select a monitoring project and an epoch for that, so a timestamp. One thing to note, because we are using a Trimble cloud service, a Trimble ID sign-on is required. So if you don't have one, there's a big blue button there on the left-hand side that says create new Trimble ID. Essentially, all you need is your email address and password. Once you sign in, you'll see a list of existing projects. If you have any, most cases you probably won't. So you might want, you'll probably be starting by creating a new one. Step 3 there, the third image in this slide, is once we've created our new project, we select that date stamp for the set of data. So that current set of data in TBC is the one that you're selecting the timestamp for, so when that was collected. And then you'll notice in the Project Explorer, we have a new entity called the monitoring project. Once we've got the monitoring project, we choose which points we want to actually monitor. So in this case, on the right-hand side, I'm selecting 43 points, and those are the points that I want to generate displacements for. And then I synchronize that data with the cloud project. And of course, now if we see on the left-hand side, in the properties pane, for the monitoring points, we have displacements as well as thresholds that you can set. And then once you've got 2 or more epochs, step 7, we can generate 3D displacement vectors, which you can see in the plan view, and those are colored based on whether the point displacement falls outside of those thresholds or not. Green meaning good, yellow meaning it falls outside of the warning threshold, red meaning it falls outside of the alarm. We also have a nice monitoring point spreadsheet, very similar to other spreadsheets in TBC. We're essentially showing all of the properties of those monitoring points in one nice spreadsheet view, which you can filter and sort through. There's an interactive monitoring chart. So this is very powerful. It's an individual point chart. So you select a single monitoring point, and you can see different components of displacement for that point. You can turn them on and off, and you can also scale along the time series if you want to focus in on a certain point of time. And then the last is the monitoring report, which it's quite comprehensive. I can't show it in one screenshot, unfortunately. That's why I have multiple there, but it includes scatter plots for outlier detection, time series displacement charts for all of the points as well as single points, and table views highlighting the different points over compared to the reference epoch. So I think I've hammered in pretty hard what the workflow is. So I think a better point now is I'll stop briefly for questions just to take a look here, and then we'll go into the demonstration. So let me see, I see there's a few that have been asked. I'm just going to make this a little larger so I can read it all. So let's see here. First question, can I monitor? Oh, wait here. So a question, can I monitor with point clouds? So yeah, so how the monitoring module in TBC works is it's all based on point ID. So every time I measure that point in the field, let's say I'm measuring the face of a building, and I call that point 100. Each time I measure that point, it's point 100, and that's how we designate how we compare the data over time. So with scanning, because it's not a singular point, it's a massive set of points, we can pick using different tools in TBC that same point out of the point cloud to create a discrete point for it and then monitor. So tools like the virtual DR tool in TBC, the create points tool, those are the kind of step in between the scan data and getting it into a monitoring workflow. All right, some more questions. Thank you everyone for all the great questions. I'm glad to see it. We've got an interactive audience this morning. Sorry, just making these bigger. Some of them are quite long. So will this be an extra fee for this module, or is it being added to TBC version 5.4? It is a module, so it is an add-on to any of the TBC editions. So there's 3 TBC editions, if I can remember the name. Basically, the field, intermediate, and advanced, and the monitoring module can be added on to intermediate and advanced. So it is a purchase price, and it is an add-on to an edition. Next question from Alexander, if we use CSV files, does it include raw data and residuals? So what the TBC monitoring module does is it's looking strictly at displacement. So we're comparing 3D, well, even 1D, 2D, 3D positions over time. So not necessarily the residuals between, let's say, adjustments or anything like that, but more the displacement values. Another question from Alexander, can I create a project to monitor the horizontal and vertical displacements in time, say monthly or annual, of a cores network I use? Short answer is yes, you can. As long as you have that data, we can report those displacements in both 1D being vertical, 2D being horizontal, as well as 3D, a combination of both. Another question, just to be clear, does this exist in TBC yet? So that's a great question. I'm glad you brought up. So no, it's not available right now. It will be available in the next release of TBC coming up, which is version 5.4, and that will be coming up very soon here. Another question about when it'll be released. So it's, once again, it's not available right at this moment, but it will be available very soon. Does the data need to be, so this question from Lucas, does the data need to be collected with Trimble monitoring, or can it be collected with Trimble Access? It can be collected with anything. As long as that data can be imported in TBC, it doesn't matter where it comes from. I'm only mentioned Trimble Access monitoring for, it's specifically used for monitoring purposes. So it's just a useful field application to streamline that. But you could collect data. Let's say you're collecting digital level data with a DINI level, you could do that. You could collect it with a RTK receiver. Really doesn't matter as long as it can be imported into TBC. All right, so I answered a lot of questions. I'm going to leave the rest for now, but feel free to keep putting in more. I'll save some more time throughout the presentation to answer these. So talking more about the demonstration of the module. So I want to set a little bit of context for the data in the demonstration. So essentially I have a set of data where we're monitoring a building, and we've got 2 sets of data that we'll go through, but I also have multiple epochs, and we'll see how that looks after you get 10 or more epochs in TBC. And we've got a combination of both GNSS static observations and total station rounds in this project. I've also got an example of how you can see the monitoring data in context with an IFC design file, or really, if you had any CAD design in TBC, it would work the same. And then we'll show the required reporting to show those displacement and movement trends in TBC. So with that, I am going to open the first TBC project. And so now we've got the TBC project. I've got data already imported, but you can see the blue lines are GNSS vectors from some nearby stations. And if I zoom in, I've got the green lines, which are total station measurements for those monitoring points. And this is here, just for context, this is anyone who's been there, this is a Trimble building in Westminster, Colorado. All right, so we've got our first set of data. Now, if I want to, before I do any of the monitoring, I could go through and, for instance, go to the network adjustment tool, and I could run a network adjustment. I could do any edits to the raw data as necessary. I'll do one here just for example's sake, and I'll run an adjustment. We'll see if my results are any good. So once that runs through, we'll have my error ellipses and some estimates here. Of course, this adjustment failed, so I could go through and do all the proper weighting or look at any any issues I might have with the raw data. For the purpose of this example, we won't bother just because of time, but we'll leave it how it is. So you got the error ellipses there. So we've done our adjustments, we've collected the data, now I want to monitor it. So if I go here in TBC in the top of the ribbon, we see there's a new monitoring tab. And with that tab, we've got 6 new commands. And you'll notice to start with, there's only one command that you can access. And the reason for that is essentially putting the workflow in context. So we start on the left-hand side and we work our way across in terms of which commands we use in order. So of course, we start with the assign monitoring project. So what this is we're choosing or creating a monitoring project, which all our data is going to be associated to. As I mentioned before, you need to sign in with your Trimble ID. And if you don't have one, you run through this little quick step to create a new one. There's many ways that you may already have a Trimble ID. For instance, if you're using Trimble Sync Manager with Trimble Access and TBC, you'll have a Trimble ID. If you're using a variety of other Trimble products like SketchUp or Tekla or anything like that, there's a good chance you might have a Trimble ID as well. So I'll enter mine here. Hopefully nobody steals my password. All right, so I'll sign in. And once I'm done signing in, the command will pop up on the right-hand side. And it'll take a few seconds because it's checking to see what existing projects I have. So if you don't have any, it probably won't take very long at all. In this case, you'll see I have quite a few projects that I've already created. And what we'll do with this is assume that I don't have an existing monitoring project already created, and I'll create a new monitoring project here in TBC. And then once that project is created, we choose the timestamp for it for the data set that's currently sitting in TBC. So the data that I have here. I think my internet's a bit slow being that I'm on a webinar here, so just bear with me. Taking quite a long time. All right, so while that's working through, here that I also have a second set of data. So this is the other TBC project, which we'll compare to the current monitoring data set. And then once that's all done, I'll show you the outcomes. And so loading is we'll have our design data with those displacement here. So we see here are the displacement vectors after we've got multiple epochs, and they're showing the 3D displacement value and how it's moving relative to the position of those points. All right, let's go back and see if that project has finished loading. It's taking quite a long time and I'm not sure why. Give me 1 second. The joys of giving a live demo, everyone. I hope you never have to do it. All right, so while that's loading, maybe I'll answer some questions and be useful with this time here. So another question here about, oops. What was used to, question from John, what was used to display the building as you have them? Not sure exactly the question. Are you referring to the model in TBC? If so, it's an IFC file. I believe it was created from a design software. I'm not sure which one exactly. I'm guessing it's probably from something like SketchUp or something equivalent. Good question from Alexander. Can it use RTX online post-processing reports? So once again, anything that is defined in TBC with a point ID and a position can be monitored. So if you can get that post-process result from RTX into TBC, then yes, it can be used. So it looks like I'm having a bit of trouble here. So let's try with a different TBC project, see if we can get this up and running. Another question that came up from Pedro, can we go on to site to do the campaign with points in a CSV file and stake out points like measuring rounds? So I think that's in reference to Trimble Access monitoring, I think if I'm reading that correct. And so yes, there's a few ways you can use Trimble Access monitoring. You can import the data via a rounds list, so basically a CSV file that shows where all those points are and what type of target they are, Prism, DR. You can also just define those in Trimble Access as well, and then you can just run the measuring rounds routine in Trimble Access monitoring. And other questions here. One question from David, good question. When we do displacements, while he's doing that, it seems I have a bit of an issue with TBC, so I'm going to restart it and see if we can get this up and running again. So one moment, everybody. And I'll restart it just to make sure. Maybe I did something wrong along the ways. So another question while that's going on. So can we do displacements perpendicular to alignment? Sorry, David, come back to your question. So yes, you can get displacements, but you can't do them perpendicular to alignment right now. That is something I think is really powerful capability and something that we're definitely going to look at into the future, especially with this TBC monitoring module, because that's very useful for a lot of reasons, whether it's a road that might be defined by alignment, a bridge, railway, tunnel, a lot of useful applications for that. So short answer is no, we can't do it in this first version of the TBC monitoring module, but we'll hopefully have that sometime in the future. So another question here. Can we apply different weights to different monitoring sessions? From Troy. So it depends what you mean by weights. If it's in, let's say, in an adjustment, yes, you could do it in the adjustment. There's no weighting that we can apply currently into the monitoring. We're essentially doing a point-to-point displacement calculation. So there's no least squares or anything going into the actual monitoring displacement calculation or any adjustment of that sort. So short answer is no, but I would be curious to hear more from you, Troy, on what exactly, or maybe some project examples of where you'd use that. So feel free to send me an email. Dylan asked a question. Is it advised to create a new Trimble Access job each time points are observed in the field? So question about Trimble Access monitoring. It depends if you, I guess, on what the job is and what the purpose is. So if it's the same job, let's say I'm measuring the same structure every time, you can do both. You can create a new job, or you can use the same job and monitor essentially another set of rounds. It really depends on your workflow. Sorry guys, just opening up TBC again to make sure we've got this running. Another question from David. Man, we've got quite a long list of questions. Thanks everyone. How customizable are the reports? We generally prepare 2 reports for each epoch, displacement from the initial epoch and displacement from the previous. So right now it's a standard report, doesn't have much customization to it. It does have the information that you're asking for in it, and I'll show you that here in a minute. So once we've got that, just give me a moment here. Another question from David. Do you have to rename the point each time you store a new one? Not necessarily. So because this is using multiple TBC projects, you won't have multiple points with different, won't have multiple points with the same ID in it. You could, but how TBC works is it essentially asks you to define what is making the coordinates for that point. So if I have 5 different coordinates for that point, I have to choose which of those coordinates is defining it. All right. Question about T4D. Just to be clear, this doesn't depend on T4D. So TBC monitoring module sits independently of T4D, so you don't actually need that module. And then another question from John, how do you combine conventional total station and digital level data on the same point if we're monitoring horizontal and vertical? So TBC, essentially you by point ID. So if your level observation has the same point ID as the total station, you can merge them together, and you can actually define that the vertical component of that point is defined by the level measurements, and the easting and northing is defined by the total station measurements. So once again, that's really the power of TBC and why you would want to use it with the monitoring module. All right. Question about, can I process GKA files obtained daily by Trimble S9 on reflectors located on a land side? So not GKA files specifically, because I don't believe you can import those in TBC. Granted, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but you can import, let's say if you're using Trimble Access with that Trimble S9, you can import a job file or a CSV file from those positions measured. When it comes to landslides, I would typically recommend using an automated system depending on the level of safety or risk and as well as the measurement frequency. And TBC might not be the best approach for that. Instead, T4D might be a better approach for the automated component. So Chad asked a question, what would happen if a point was missed at any particular epoch? So you can still upload any of the other points. So if you have a list of 10 and point number 9, it was missed, you can still upload all other 9 points. The only caveat I'll say is if you do measure that point 9 again, you'll have to just upload it with the right date for when you did measure it. So it's really just handles it all. It doesn't matter. You don't need to have all of those same points every time. You can have 1 or 2. You can even add new ones throughout the project. So for instance, if I had 10 points on day 1 and then on day 2 I had 15 points, I could still add 15 points and I would have 5 new points to the existing 10. Let's see here. Now, a lot of questions. I think I'm only halfway through. Do epochs need to be measured on a total station, or does a GPS epoch work too? Yeah, you can use GPS, so you could use RTK, you could use static GNSS, as well as total station. So it's really up to you what you're using. Once again, as long as once you import it into TBC, it's defined by a point, you can monitor it. It doesn't really matter. All right, I have to apologize, folks. It seems like my internet connection isn't running too well, and I can't get this up and running. So what I'll do instead is I'll show the outcome of the data that once you've got those monitoring points in TBC, what that looks like, and I'll show some examples here of some reports for that. One moment to share my screen again. So look at some more questions while that's loading. Are there any new features related to the use of point clouds for monitoring? Nothing specifically for monitoring. There'll be some new stuff. I believe last week there was a great webinar by the TBC team that went over some point cloud tools. And so I'd suggest go looking at that one, Chad. I think that covered some great tools that may or may not be related to monitoring, might be related to other applications. All right, folks, so give me 1 second, this TBC project is loading. Is it possible to set different alarm thresholds for different instruments? Question from Adrian. Example being different thresholds for GNSS versus DINI leveling. So not individually within the point. So a monitoring point itself sits kind of with its own thresholds. You can change though the 1D, 2D, and 3D alarm thresholds. So for instance, you know that your elevation is really tight because you're using a digital level. So you can set that threshold down smaller for that specific point, but you can set, let's say, maybe you expect the total station observations to be a bit more loose, and you can set the 2D threshold higher. So yes, you can kind of have different thresholds based on that. And as long as that point is defined by both the GNSS and the leveling measurement, then that will work. All right, so question about the price of TBC. So as always, I'm deflecting that one. I apologize, but that you can find out. Just reach out to your local Trimble distributor, and they can get you that price. No problem. All right. So I hope everyone can see my screen again. It was paused before, and I think it's active now. Here we go. All right, and so we'll just go through here. It seems that our Trimble ID service is down at the moment, unfortunately, the woes of using internet. So we'll just look at an existing project that I have here. So I've already gone through the process of adding several epochs of data to the monitoring project. So if you look here on the left-hand side, I've got this monitoring project in the Project Explorer. And I've got several sets of monitoring points. So if I look through, these are all different monitoring points. So for instance, if I want to look at, let's see here, WCO2, I can go to the properties. And in that point, once it loads up, you'll see for a monitoring point, we have really 3 categories. We have just some general information about that point. So the reference timestamp being essentially your first measurement, your baseline, your reference measurement, when that is. So in this case, it was October 30th, and whether this point was synchronized or not with the TBC monitoring project. Excuse me. And then the displacement. So this displacement is calculated based on the epoch of this current TBC project versus the reference epoch. So in this case, we're working in feet, decimal feet, and it's quite small displacements if you look at it. So 0.002 of a foot. So very small displacements. And if I look at the thresholds, this is where I believe John or David asked a question around, and I apologize if I got the name wrong, around setting different thresholds. So this is where I could set those different thresholds. So for instance, let's look at a point here that's got a higher displacement. So for instance, this point here, I've set my elevation warning at 0.016, but my 3D and my 2D warning, even though that's unrealistic at 0.01, that's what it's set at. But I could change these differently. So for instance, if I wanted 0.02, or if I wanted my alarm threshold, so this is where the difference between the warning and the alarm threshold is where warning is, we might need to look at this point a little more close. Alarm thresholds is, okay, there's something wrong here, we need to do something, we need to make an action. And you can see those visually in TBC looking at the colors of the displacement vectors. So if you look here in the 3D view on the right-hand side, I have some in green, some in yellow, and some in red. So the red are any that are out of the alarm threshold, yellow are any that are out of the warning, and green are good, so they're not out of either of those thresholds. So once again, I'll go open the monitoring points here. And so you can change those thresholds any way you want, and it'll update the color of those displacement vectors. Another thing that I think is really powerful with these 3 displacement vectors that we can see in these 2 views, if I zoom in, you'll notice that they scale with the zoom. I can actually change the size, the scaling of those vectors if I want, and you can find that in the project settings. So if I open up project settings, oops, here we go, and I go under view, there's a monitoring tab, and I can change the length of those vectors. Let's say 600 is too big, maybe I only want 400. And when I press OK, it'll update essentially the scale of those displacement vectors. So they're really useful for simple visualization of the movement on site. So in this case, if we look on the right-hand side and we look at those displacement vectors, they're actually all trending somewhat in an upward and in a southerly direction. So there's actual kind of movement trending in a certain direction. And that gives us an idea of what's happening on the site. Maybe there's some heave in those points due to temperature fluctuations or whatever it might be. All right, so now that that's loaded up, what we can also look at is with the monitoring point spreadsheet, we can open up a list of all of those displacements and whether those points are fallen in and out of thresholds. So for example, we notice that there's a lot of points that are green and there's some points that are in yellow and red that haven't fallen out of, or that have fallen out of thresholds. Apologize, it's just taking a minute to load up. I have a large IFC files, which I think is why it's taking so long to load. So a question came in about trials available for this. Yes, there will be trials available. So what I suggest is reach out to your local Trimble distributor and they'll get you a trial code for this so you can give it a test run. I'm going to load up that monitoring point spreadsheet here to give everybody an idea what that looks like. Another question that came in, is there a project setting to, thanks Joe for asking this, is there a project setting for warning and thresholds that set them on a project wide scale? So there isn't at this point. What we do is we choose a default value. I can't think of the value actually off the top of my head for 1D, 2D, and 3D. And then if you want to change thresholds for, let's say, different points or all of the points, you simply do a multi-select in TBC like so. On the left-hand side, you click a point, shift click, and you select all those points, and then you could go into the properties and change all of those points at once. But good question, thank you, Joe. So back to the demo here. I'm just going to exit out of these views to make them a little bit bigger. The monitoring point spreadsheet essentially shows all of those displacements and thresholds. Oops. Messing around with TBC views, apologize everyone. It shows all of those thresholds and point IDs in one nice view. So for instance, if I want to know what the highest displacements are in the project, I could go to the 2D column here and I could click on it to filter those points based on displacement level for 2D. So you can see that T-box point ID has the highest with 0.011, and then we can scroll down the list and see other ones. In this view, I can also change those thresholds again. So if I think that 2D warning maybe is too small and I want to increase it to 0.05, I can do that. And the reason it's got that little red exclamation point is because the 2D warning is actually higher than the 3D warning. So it's telling you, okay, this doesn't make sense. You need to change the 3D warning as well. So I'll just change that 3D warning and make it higher. And there we go. And there was another question that came in. Can we reassign the reference epoch or redefine the reference coordinate after the first epoch, for example, in the middle of the campaign? Yeah, so when it comes to the epochs, the TBC project, which that data was originally imported and assigned to, that is your governing, let's say, coordinates for those epochs. So for instance, if on day 3, I need to go back and edit some data, and I've got day 1 to 10 already in that project, I open up the TBC project that has day 3, I change the adjustment, I change whatever it is about that coordinate that I need to adjust. Maybe I just want to remove it. And I remove it from that project and resynchronize it. So just pressing the button here, Sync Monitoring Project, and that will update it across the whole monitoring project. So really, what I suggest for anyone using this monitoring module is you focus on saving your TBC projects with a date stamp associated to that data. So for instance, let's say this data set here was for October 30th. I should say probably the TBC project title have October 30th, 2020 in it, just so I'm aware of it and makes easier data management in the end. So one thing I'll show here is because I've made that change to this point, so the threshold change to this point parking here, it's shown in red on the TBC Project Explorer. The reason being is it's signifying to you that, hey, there's been a change to this point. It needs to be resynchronized to the TBC project. So basically just saying you need to resynchronize it so everything's in order and we don't have any discrepancy. Very similar if you compare it to the project recompute project in TBC, this little red button at the top. It's kind of notifying you that you've made a change and you need to synchronize the data again. So if I click the Sync Monitoring Project command, what it'll do is it'll check any existing data in TBC and any changes that have been made and resynchronize it with the cloud project and make sure that that data is all the same. So essentially what we're doing here is updating in the cloud project the threshold of that point. But if, for instance, I had changed the coordinates at that point, that parking point, then I would want to resynchronize it because then it'll update in the project. All right, so let's show some of the things that are my favorite, which are the charts and the reports. All right, so I'm going to stop answering questions for a little bit here and just finish off this demo with some of the good deliverables that we can create in TBC. So this monitoring point chart, what it does is you select an individual point. So in this case, I had selected the parking point here on the left-hand side, and it creates an interactive displacement chart showing all of the epochs for that specific point. So here in the graph on the left-hand side, I've got the displacement value. And then on the bottom or the x-axis, we have the date range. So you can see that we started here on October 30th, and we've gone all the way to November 10th. Now, right now, if I hover over one of these epochs, you'll notice that it shows that date for when it was measured. It also shows the components, the displacement components that I'm currently showing. So in this case, delta 2D, delta elevation, and their actual value. So I can scroll along and kind of interpret, maybe there's certain areas where I'm confused. Why is that so high or why is that so low? The other powerful ability is to show all of the displacement components. So I'm going to turn on all of them. So I have delta 2D, delta 3D, and then delta easting, elevation, and northing all shown in the same graph. And I can query along that time series. Another really powerful tool is if I select a single component, such as if I turn off everything but 2D, it will show the thresholds for that 2D value. So what I've set for the thresholds, it'll show anything in the yellow region as being in the warning threshold, and anything in the red being in the alarm. So if I scroll along here, I see that a lot of these points are out of the alarm threshold. So something's going on. I probably should have looked at this a long time ago. So that gives you some good idea and context for that individual point. The other cool thing about this is I can zoom into a specific set or a specific time range in that. So right now I'm showing all of the points, but let's say I wanted to look here at this area here in the middle. I can click and drag and select that window, that time window, and it'll zoom in to that specific area. So I can kind of deep dive into a certain date range if there's an issue or maybe some outliers. And then on the bottom, I can do the same thing. I can drag this left and right to show different time series. And of course, like anything in TBC, we want to be able to output this if you want to include it in a bigger, more general report. The top right, there's a little button to download it as an image file or print it out. So you could print it out to PDF or anything else. So that's the interactive chart. The last thing, and probably one of my favorite parts of the whole workflow, is the comprehensive report. So I could run this report for individual points or a group of points, and I can also run it for all points. So in this case, I'm just going to run it for everything. So I'll click that command. So if I wanted to run the report just for like a couple points, I would select those points first here in the Project Explorer and the plan view, and then run the command. But in this case, I want to see everything. Looks better, gives me more context. So the report is kind of in three or four sections here. And the first section is some basic header statistic information about the project. So the name, the date range, the time zone, and then some coordinate system information. Here you can see, because we're in Colorado, we're running on the state plane system, and we've got a geoid model as well. The second section is a scatter plot section. So to give you context, if you look at the legend here in the bottom right, the points are colored based on the epoch. So you'd see that color bar changes over the time series of this project. So if I look at this first scatter plot on the left, I have delta northing component versus delta easting component. And why these are really useful, or one reason these are really useful, is I can see significant outliers, because most points here are sitting in this section here. They're just to the right, and so a slight bit of delta easting. But I'll notice that there's a few points here sitting up in this region that are kind of outliers. And so I can take a kind of investigative approach using these different scatter plots to look at outliers. The next section is displacement charts showing, in this case, all of the points in one chart for each component. So in this case, we're looking at the easting component, and I'm looking at all points on that chart, with the blue line being the running average displacement across all of those points. And this gives me really good context if there's a certain movement trend in all of the points, or outliers as well. I can see here there's a significant drop in the easting for some reason on this point. And we do the same thing for the northing, as well as the height components for those charts. And then from there, we break it down into the same type of charts, but for each point, it's individually. So in this case, we're kind of looking at more of our building points that we've measured here. This is building 2 West Point. And you notice that there's some unique symbols here. So the yellow triangles signify any points that were out of the warning threshold. So remember, yellow equals warning. And the red stars signify any points that were outside of the alarm threshold. And you can see that in the legend up here. And so it creates one of these for each of the points, and we've got a whole bunch of them in our project. So I'll just scroll through these really fast so you can get an idea of how those look. Now, when we get to the bottom in the last section, what we have is more of a table view of all of those displacements. So in this case, we start by showing some general information. So what are the warning and alarm thresholds for each of the points that you've set? And then we get into the useful stuff here, which is the actual displacement report. So what we do is for each epoch, we show the point ID, the coordinates for that specific epoch, the delta to the previous epoch, and the delta to the reference. So I believe this is a question that was asked from somebody earlier. And you'll notice with the first reading, obviously we don't have any displacements because there's no other measurements to compare it to. But as we go through and we get multiple readings over time, so let's look at November 1st. We've got the delta to the previous epoch here in the middle. So it gives me all of the values for that. It gives me also at the end, the delta reference, and it highlights any deltas that are out of those tolerances in the proper color as well. And of course, it'll do this for every epoch. So I go through, you'll see there's multiple epochs across that project. And with any report in TBC, we can also download this here in the top right-hand corner. We can download it and we can also print it out. So if you want to print it to a printer or to a PDF, you can do so. So those are the primary deliverables coming out of the TBC monitoring module. And I apologize I wasn't able to show kind of the full workflow, but there will be some YouTube videos coming out here very soon that show this in more detail. And with that, what I'm going to do now, because we're at the top of the hour, I'm just going to quickly run through some resources for everybody and answer any other questions that I haven't got to. So in summary, one thing I want to mention is just going through that workflow again. So you collect the data in the field your way, doesn't matter how you do it as long as you're collecting data, and you import it into TBC, and you create a TBC project for each epoch of that data. You synchronize all of that data with the monitoring project, define any of those thresholds if the default thresholds don't work for you, and then view the 3D displacement vectors. So you're looking at trends, you're looking at how big the movement actually is, and also those displacement reports and charts. So one thing that I want to note here at the bottom right is because this Trimble ID sign-on is required to do the synchronization and the signing of monitoring projects, you do need to have internet connectivity. And one other item, we highly recommend that everybody has a Trimble Connect business account. That'll allow you to create more than one project in the Trimble cloud. So resources. So hopefully this has all been informative for you and you're all excited to test this out. The TBC monitoring module will be coming available in December, so hopefully you'll hear more about that very soon as we're coming to the end of November. And just to reiterate, it is an add-on module for TBC Intermediate or Advanced Edition, either of those. And there will be demo codes available. Just reach out to your local distributor and they will get a demo code to you. Some more information, if you're curious more about monitoring in general, we actually have some really great resources on the monitoring.trimble.com website. We have automated monitoring systems running, live monitoring systems that you can actually go into your web browser and see what those look like and the deliverables that are coming out of those. We also have quite a few different project examples and stories of others that have been doing monitoring and being successful with it. Some general resources information. We've got a great YouTube page where we have a massive growing library of how-to videos, lots on T4D, and we're getting more and more for TBC monitoring as well as Trimble Access monitoring. There's a Trimble monitoring community, which is kind of a general user forum. You can go on there, answer questions, ask questions yourself, and the Trimble monitoring team, as well as other users, monitoring customers and service providers that will be on there answering and asking questions as well. We're continuing this monitoring power hour webinar series. I think we're up to around 8 webinars so far, and we'll be continuing to do that. So keep an eye out for notifications of next month's and the following months. Typically they're every third Wednesday of a month, so you can mark your calendars for that. Any of the previous webinars have also been recorded, so you can find those on the Trimble Geospatial webinars website. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time and anyone who's sat in an extra 5 minutes. I will go through and answer some more questions here since so many have been asked. I really appreciate it from everybody. So let's start. John had a great question. Oh, sorry, Donovan had a question. Are these tables editable? Can I create a template? So right now the table, so I think you're referring to the monitoring report in TBC. So they're not editable, and it's a standard report kind of straight out of the box of what you get. But that's a good point. I think is something for us to look into the future of kind of customization capabilities. Lucas question asked about, can we calculate radial displacements like in T4D control? So right now displacements are strictly calculated as point to point. So really a difference between coordinates is how they're calculated. All right, question from William. Can we change the initial reading set with latest measurements? Yes, once again, what the best way to do that is, for example, I have 4 epochs, which means I have 4 TBC projects. And let's say for epoch 2, I need to change those measurements. Maybe I used the wrong prism. You would open that TBC project, you would update all those prism types in TBC, and then resynchronize the project, and would update all of that coordinate information to the monitoring project. So any time you run the report or the charts later on, it'll have the updated values. So Mateo asked a question, can I export an image or a view with the movements vectors? Yes, so there's a variety of ways you can do that. You can actually do a screen capture if you want of TBC, but you could do any of the drafting capabilities of TBC, as well as there is some basic exports. With the point charts, you can export the point chart out as an image file. Chris asked a question regarding coordinates. Can monitoring be done in local coordinates, or does it need GPS coordinates? No, Chris, it can be done, well, I guess yes is the answer to there. It can be done in local coordinates. So as long as it's got a XYZ, XYZ, you can do monitoring with it. Doesn't matter whether it's in absolute or it's in local coordinates. So I'm just looking through. I know there's some other questions that I didn't get to, so I want to make sure I answer a few more. All right, question is here, is it possible to upload data such as traverse and rounds of different measurements through a text file? Yes, it is, as long as TBC can support that file format. So a good example is if I have points defined in a CSV, I can import that into TBC using the import format editor. Another question here, can TBC handle SX10 and X7 data? So yes, you can import SX10 and X7 data into TBC. So with the SX10, it imports images, point clouds, and all of the total station observations. There's a question about here from Martha about using TBC for dimensional control in fabrication. It's not really phrased in a question, so Artha, if you could re-ask that or put some clarification here, I would be more than happy to look into that with you. Is it possible to set different alarm thresholds for different instruments? Answer is essentially yes. You don't set it relative to the instrument, you set it relative to the displacement value. So whether it's the elevation, the horizontal, or the 3D value. Another question about where do the buildings come from in the TBC project? I'm guessing it was a design software somewhere. It was imported as an IFC file. So just showing you some of the different design file support that is in TBC. So I think I'll take one more question and then we'll close the webinar out. So there was a question about how can I download TBC, which is a great question. So if you go on, if you can even go into Google and just type Trimble Business Center, you can download a free version of TBC from there. It's the viewer version of TBC. It doesn't have all of the capabilities that you'll typically need, but it allows you to download the software. And then what I would suggest is reach out to your local distributor if you don't have a license and get a demo code, and then you can play around with TBC to your heart's desire. All right, so I really appreciate all the great questions, everyone. Phenomenal turnout and interaction from everyone on the call. If you do have any other questions, though, feel free to reach out to me. As always, my email inbox is open for you to barrage me with questions, and I'm more than happy to answer them all. And if not, so we'll look forward to seeing everybody in the next Monitoring Power Hour, hopefully coming up in December. And with that, thanks for everybody. Take care, stay safe out there, and we'll see you again.